Hi. So in the last video of this lecture, I want to talk a little bit more about the idea that what might distinguish the Chicago housing demolitions from moving to opportunity from the provision of housing vouchers is the fact that the housing demolitions were non-voluntary. So just to remind you, this is not the only explanation for why moved to opportunity, why the housing demolitions had larger positive effects on children than did the housing vouchers. It could also be that the Chicago public housing projects were just uniquely bad, right? That the concentration of poverty was significantly higher. It could be that children get benefits from having their old neighborhood be demolished. In other words, that whereas in moving to opportunity, it was possible for kids who felt lonely, who felt socially isolated in their new neighborhood, to go back to their old neighborhood and socialize with their old friends, potentially falling into the same sorts of bad habits they would have wanted to avoid. If your housing project is demolished, that's no longer possible, and you don't have the choice anymore to go back to your old social network. But the third possibility, and the one that I think deserves a little bit more discussion, is that the 25% or so of families that chose to apply for a moving to opportunity voucher might be different from the 75% of families that chose not to. So the first thing I want to do is highlight for you how different these results are. So if we look at these two important outcomes, right, the percentage employed and the change in earnings, what we're going to see is that the Chicago housing demolition had much larger average effects than did the Section 8 vouchers for moving to opportunity, which is the exact same policy, right? In both cases, we're talking about people being given Section 8 vouchers who had been living in high-rise public housing. The only real difference, well, as we've talked about, there's the difference of the demolition. The difference in these populations is really just that this demolition includes 100% of families. This voucher receipt includes the 75% who agreed to take vouchers. So if we think about how the effects of moving out of high-rise public housing are going to affect that 25% who volunteered to move out compared to the 75% who did not volunteer to move out, broadly speaking, there's two sets of stories. In the first story, the families that choose to move out, that volunteer to move out, are going to be the families that benefit the most from leaving high-rise public housing. And the story here is fairly simple, right? We might expect that the kind of people who are going to choose to take advantage of a new program are the people who are going to find that program most helpful, right? Who perceive the biggest benefits. And we might also think that the kind of parents who are going to hear about a new program and take advantage, right, take a risk in moving their family to a new neighborhood, might be more motivated, more engaged, and in a better position to help their kids take advantage of the opportunities and advantages inherent in living in a lower poverty neighborhood, right? So all of that would lead to saying that those 25% would benefit more than would the rest of the residents of the high-rise public housing project. On the other hand, we might think that the families that would choose to take advantage of this program, who would choose to move out when given the opportunity, might be the families that benefit the least, at least in terms of these things that we're measuring, right? Crime, employment, and earnings. And the reason for this is we might think that people who decide to leave public housing might be the people who perceive it in the most negative way, who are most worried about crime or disorder, who have the fewest friends and are the most socially isolated within the public housing project. And the result of that might be that while they're going to be pretty unhappy if they remain in the public housing project, they're also likely to socially isolate their children. So their children are going to be less exposed to social influences in public housing and more likely to seek out alternative ways to invest in their children. So what we might expect to see is that parents who perceive public housing to be relatively benign or relatively benevolent are going to let their kids engage more socially. Their kids might be happier and have a better time, but also be more likely to end up falling into the behavior patterns that are more common among public housing recipient or high-rise public housing recipients than other people. On the other hand, the parents who perceive it most negatively are going to do the most to reduce the influence of public housing on their kids, and therefore might have kids that have the higher levels of employment, earnings, education, and lower levels of crime when remaining in public housing. So as we talked about a little bit before break, in the qualitative analysis of moving to opportunity, there's some evidence that this is the case. So the researchers who did the qualitative analysis wrote as a summary of their interviews, we came to realize during our interviews that these mothers were more than simply concerned for their children. They had organized their entire lives around protecting their sons and daughters from the genuine dangers of ghetto life. These children had witnessed gunshots in their park, drive-by shootings, bloodstained bodies, domestic violence, frequent fights, and play areas littered with broken drug paraphernalia. In response, their mothers tended to isolate themselves, communicating with few others, and developing feelings of mistrust. These mothers became intensely focused on their children, always taking them along on errands, waiting with them at the bus stop, and keeping them inside or watching them play from a window or a seat on the stoop. So if we think about what that looks like from the perspective of our social distancing model, what this might mean is that children who have parents who engage in that sort of behavior, who socially isolate them from the community in the public housing projects, take them on errands, and don't let them play outside, are going to have weaker connections to the friends who are sharing their experience. And as a result, when they're making their decisions about things like how much crime to engage in, how much employment to engage in, how much education to engage in, they're going to choose levels that are individually optimal rather than individually plus socially optimal. In other words, the role of social influence is going to be smaller for their decisions. To the extent that the social influence they would experience in high-rise public housing would result in lower levels of education and employment and higher levels of crime, that would result in behavior in lower levels of crime and higher levels of education than would be engaged in by children who are more socially integrated into public housing. We can also think about this using our Becker human capital model. We can think about these sorts of intensive monitoring activities by parents as a sort of investment in children, right? An investment in protecting children from a dangerous environment. As a result, we can think about moving to a lower poverty neighborhood as essentially a form of public investment, right? Or a way of increasing the child's market-based luck or endowment. In other words, the well-being of children absent investment goes up because the children are now in a less dangerous environment. Because of that, what our models predict is that parents are going to reduce their level of private investment when their children's market-based luck and endowments get better, right? So essentially, we might think that the parents who are highly motivated to reduce the level of exposure their children have to dangerous neighborhoods are going to respond to being put in a better neighborhood, in part by going a little bit easier and taking some of that surplus for themselves. In contrast, parents who didn't see the need to engage in that sort of intensive parenting or intensive monitoring in high-rise public housing will reduce their investments by less because they were investing less to begin with. And as a result, the benefits to their kids are going to be larger. Okay, so that's all for today. I just wanted to say thank you for bearing with me and paying attention through these videos. And I really look forward to discussing this paper with all of you, or hopefully as many of you as possible, via Blue Jeans, Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Hope you're all doing wonderfully, and I'll talk to you soon.